This is the Texas Land Guys podcast, hosted by brothers Tim Dosch and Tom Dosch. With their partners David Marshall and Trip Rich, they have built DMRE, the leading land brokerage in Texas. With decades of experience brokering deals between landowners and real estate developers, they take you inside the deals that move the market.
Welcome to the podcast. Tim, how are you feeling this morning?
I'm doing good. Doing good.
I'm sporting a beard here. I know I've been clean shaven here for a while, but went to the mountains and decided to bring the beard back. So I've been getting a lot of comments on that around the office and from clients who haven't seen me with the beard for a while.
You're doing like the reverse summer thing. People normally like clean up a little bit and shave for the hot summer, and you're going the opposite direction, going mountain man for the summer.
Yeah, that's right. And it's obviously so hot that it's probably a bad idea. But yeah, I was told the other day that I looked like I was 12 when I shaved. So I figured it'd probably be good to bring the beard back, which was
grow it back.
Yeah.
I don't think you've had a beard on the podcast, have you?
I had not
since we started.
Yeah, no, I hadn't.
Yeah.
So get a couple recorded now and we'll see if it stays or not. But it's always
I like it. Look, it looks good.
It's a battle around the house.
Good.
I was at dinner the other night with my 5 kids. I was asking them, keep the beard, remove the beard. Once I got down to like the 2-year-old, then it was kind of questionable how much she was being influenced by the older siblings. But
by everybody else,
the boys,
what was the vote?
The boys were saying to shave it, and then my oldest always wants me to have a beard. She likes the beard, and then she influenced the 2-year-old to say keep the beard. So then it was pretty much up to my wife Jackie to decide, and so Jackie's like whatever. So it was just a tie vote basically because
that's funny. Well, yeah, I guess your oldest Annette, she's probably you've had a beard for most of your life, right?
Yeah,
or most of her life.
Yeah, I think for her it's probably for sure a comfort thing for sure. So it's pretty funny. But
no, that's weird. Yeah, it's funny. That's cool. I like it. You definitely got to grow out the beard for the mountains for sure.
Well, I remember when our dad shaved his mustache because like everybody had a mustache, and that's kind of coming back. But I remember when he shaved his mustache, that was so like strange for all of us because he had it for all of our upbringing until I think you were already graduated from college when he did it. But yeah, I think for kids, it's probably a bigger deal than for us.
Well, it definitely changes the way you look for sure with facial hair.
Well, today we thought it'd be interesting to talk about I wouldn't say it's necessarily a trend because it's been going on for a while, but it is interesting timing because we're sitting in what we've been saying is kind of just a lot of uncertainty in the market where it's hard to say we're in a really good market. We can't really say we're in like a bad market. We're just in a market where deals are still happening. It's still challenging, but there's uncertainty that makes it difficult for people to really say what's going to happen. Despite that, we're still getting calls all the time from developers that are doing one of two things. They're either exiting the market and they're saying, we had sites, now we want to sell them, or, we've laid off our team, or we're getting calls from new developers saying, or a lot of times it's someone we know that's saying, hey, I left such and such developer and I'm going to go and I'm going to lead this new platform. We're based out of the Midwest, or we're based out of the East Coast or West Coast, and we have always wanted a Texas presence. And so we're going to go and we're going to be all in on Texas. And so it's interesting that you have just opposite ends of the spectrum, those two things happening at the same time. You have developers exiting the market, but then we still have a lot of new developers coming into the market.
Yeah, we've seen that our whole career. I mean, even back before the Great Recession, I remember, in Houston having a lot of new developers coming to the market, tying up deals. And, there's the stories of the developers who made a big impact. I mean, I'm thinking specifically of Houston. You've come in and done deals, been successful, done a number of deals. And then there's some that have not done well at all. Maybe they haven't closed anything. They've tied up a lot of sites and never closed a deal. Or they've done a couple deals that didn't perform well and had to exit the market. So we've kind of seen, both sides, a lot of success and then some that haven't done as well. And then I think also, what I've seen in Houston is it's normally the boom times that everybody comes in. So we've had these cycles in Houston where things are hot and everybody comes to town, everybody wants to do a deal, and then things cool off and there's a downturn. And typically a lot of those groups exit the market at that point. I would say right now we're not seeing as many new groups come in from out of town, or from out of state. I mean, I think there are those groups that are here that maybe have been here for a little while that are still active. You might be seeing that more in Dallas though, Tom, because I feel like Dallas just has such an incredible, there's so much interest across the country in Dallas, and kind of it seems maybe appears to a lot of groups to be a safer place to start. And then once they get a foothold there, maybe they, get into Houston, or maybe they're already tracking Central Texas. But it just seems like those Central Texas and Dallas have really drawn a lot of those outside of the state, groups.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I think that just with Dallas being so in demand across the country right now, it's with just the fundamentals of the investment market. A lot of these other cities, they've had a lot of growth, or now they're on decline. They've had a lot of supply delivered. Dallas has such good job and population growth, and it's just considered, such a strong city to invest in, that I think if you don't have a presence in Texas, and specifically Dallas, you're probably kind of scratching your head and saying, like, why are we just doing deals in, Florida or California or some of the other areas in those regions, and we're not in Texas? And so that's what we're hearing a lot is we want to be in Texas. Right now, most developers would say they would want to be first and foremost in DFW. And then we actually are hearing a lot of developers saying, that they would go and look in Houston, Austin. It just depends on the developer, because there's been a lot of supply there. So if you're talking about multifamily specifically, it's not necessarily going to be the first place they'll go. Although I think that had been the case the last couple of years. A lot of developers were actually starting in Austin, and then they were coming to Dallas and Houston.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. If you look at just the active, multifamily markets across the country, a lot of them are pretty small markets where it's hard to add a lot of supply, or maybe you've had a lot of supply the last couple of years. If you think of, like Tennessee and the Carolinas, and even areas like Phoenix and Denver, it's really hard to find sites. There's those markets tend to get overbuilt. So I think, Texas and Florida seem like the markets that can handle supply and absorb deals, and they're just really big markets. I mean, Dallas in particular is a really big market, so it's not going to get overbuilt as fast as maybe, some of these, kind of smaller, regional markets that are still really good, but they're, a million people, or somewhere in the 500,000 to 2 million person, population range.
I thought it'd be interesting to talk about some of these developers over time that have come in to our markets, Houston, Dallas, from either another city in Texas, and they never developed in our markets, or another state, or there's some examples where they've come from other countries, and where we've worked with them, and you know, we've seen them be really successful, and then things we've learned how to work with these developers, because there are a lot of just natural hurdles for a developer that's coming in from another market. I mean, for one thing, if you're never developed in this market, there's a lot to learn just from that standpoint. But then there's also just a knowledge of that developer in the market. If landowners have never heard of them, if they can't point to any projects, that can be challenging to overcome. But we've been able to help a lot of developers over the years to really find good opportunities, work with landowners to kind of take a chance on them by being able to explain kind of what their plans are, their capital, their background, their story to these landowners. And so thought we could maybe start with probably one of the furthest back we could go would be Watermark Residential, who I think now is, changed and branded to Thompson Thrift, but out of Indianapolis. And you started work with them before I was in the business, and they had a really strong run of deals for years in Houston, from coming into town from out of state.
Yeah, I mean, they were, that was a great recession. They were the first ones coming out of the Great Recession that started, doing deals, which is pretty interesting. And Paul Thrift, who, we have a lot of respect for, is just an amazing leader and, a great guy. He was personally coming down and going to a lot of those meetings with Johnson Development and, helping, push those deals along. But they had a pretty good run in Houston for, would you say, Tom, 8 years or 9 years, that they were active here, and they started getting into a lot of markets, Arizona and different places. They eventually exited Texas, and I think some of that was just because of how high our tax rates are here. They had some better opportunities at other places, but they executed a lot of deals, very well, and had some really successful deals that leased up well, that sold for good pricing, and They were active in Houston and I think also in Dallas, right?
They didn't develop in Dallas, but they and I think they really only developed in Houston to my knowledge, but they had a run of us doing I remember about a dozen deals with them in a pretty condensed period of time. And it's hard for me to think of another developer that was that successful, especially coming in from out of state, but never hiring anyone boots on the ground from a development standpoint in Houston. And that's really hard to do, as you know. I mean, normally what we see with that is that the developers that try to cover a market remotely, they don't tend to get deals. If they get deals, they don't tend to get the deals that make sense because they maybe don't have a really good understanding or they make mistakes that really just shouldn't be made. But I mean, these guys did a really good job. I think obviously we did a good job executing for them, bringing some really well located properties. But it's impressive that it's really of their own choosing that they decided to pull out of the market. They did really well. And like you said, I think they got on a hot streak in like Denver and just, did really
Yeah.
well on several projects out there. And I think that it's likely they'll probably find their way back. They're just really sharp developers. They'll probably find their way back to Texas. But we've worked with a lot of developers in their shoes where they're coming in, we're making offers, and it can be really difficult if you're making an offer on behalf of a developer that no one's heard of, and then they're competing with like three other offers, especially if, there's another brokerage shop maybe marketing the site and they have a relationship with one of these other developers that's offered, they're kind of like, well, why would I pick this group from Indianapolis or, we did quite a bit with the group out of Australia, quite a bit with the group out of Brazil. It's like, why do you pick these or why would they pick these buyers? And we were talking earlier about what makes these developers successful because there's kind of what we can control and what we can't control on our end. And so I think it's important to say that, we can't go help groups that don't have money buy sites ultimately. That's a problem that they have to solve on their own. But these developers like a Watermark that had strong capital and also just had really good acquisitions people. So maybe I'll let you speak to that
Mhm.
because I know that's something that you've mentioned in the past.
Yeah, I would say that there are three things that they either make a out of town developer successful or make them a failure. And they're a strong entrepreneurial leader on the development side. Um, having real capital, a way to get deals done, and then having a clear strategy, which I think is one of the most important things. Because a lot of times we'll see groups fail because they try and reproduce something in a Texas market that's maybe in a coastal market. Like we've had groups come to town that just want to do high rises or want to do these super high end infill deals, and a lot of times they come into a frothy market, so everything's really expensive. Deals are hard to underwrite. They're trying to sort of, stamp something in that was very successful, say in Miami or maybe on the West Coast or somewhere that maybe doesn't quite fit in Houston, um, or maybe fit in Dallas. And so I think the groups that have been successful, like you mentioned, Watermark. I mean, Davis Development's another one that comes to mind. They had very clear strategies, a product type that worked, that fit our market. A lot of these have been suburban developers. I mean, that'd be kind of interesting thing to talk about. It seems like the ones that haven't done as well try to go more urban and just didn't do as well. But the suburban developers who just had a really good product that didn't overbuild, that built at a good basis, tended to do pretty well. And then also, I think that didn't come in just because it was a hot time in the market and they just kind of jumped on the bandwagon. Oil prices are high. Let's go develop in Houston. If you think about Davis, they had a long term, focus on we want to be in Houston and we're going to be in Houston in good markets and bad markets. Watermark starting, really in the Great Recession, doing HUD deals and then kind of doing conventional deals after that. But really having a strategy of we're going to be here to stay. We have a product that can fit this market. We're not trying to just force something on the market that from outside that doesn't work. And then, like you said, I mean, having really strong development people, because I think that when we've seen it not work, is these groups they'll hire maybe a local person who's bounced around a little bit, or they'll bring someone to the market that is just not as strong, and they just they're become kind of a commodity. They'll go tie sites up. They don't have any better story of getting them capitalized than anyone else in the market. and they don't really know how to fit the product in to fit that submarket. So anyway, that's where we've seen some of the
Yeah,
challenges.
I think that's right. And I actually had this conversation with a developer yesterday that is not active in Dallas right now. And they want to be active in Dallas. They just started their platform in Texas. They've started by being active in some of the other cities. And Dallas is really competitive, and they don't have anybody really like boots on the ground here in Dallas from a multifamily standpoint. And it's difficult because I think you brought up a really good point about product in other markets. If you're trying to replicate maybe a deal you're doing on the coast in Florida and go do that in like a Houston or a Dallas or an Austin, it's probably not really going to connect in the market very well. And also if you're expecting that you're kind of the big fish in the pond in your market, that it's going to be like that in a place like Houston or Dallas, it's really not the
Mhm.
case. I mean, there's so many multifamily, like strong developers based in Dallas and Houston. And when it comes to good sites, we always get a lot of strong offers. I mean, we just do. And if it's especially if it's at a value that, would get people excited because there's like some kind of an opportunity from a value standpoint, in places like Houston, you would have guys come out of the woodwork, that have capital, that are long-standing developers that would show up. Whereas if you're coming from one of these other markets, again, I was talking to a developer that they built like 50% of the deals in one of these big cities in the Carolinas. And we don't have that happen in our markets. I mean, it's so competitive. We get so many different developers offering on sites, pursuing sites. And so it's important to realize like you really have to figure out how to differentiate yourself. And I think what you're saying is important. A lot of it comes down to that person that they have leading and looking for deals. And we say this a lot, like if they're willing to listen to us, because a lot of times we'll
Yeah.
give advice. We know the landowners, we know the market, we know the other developers that are making offers. We know what due diligence times are. We know what approval periods are. We know what closing periods are. We know what earnest money is. We know what pricing is. But these guys will come in, it's kinda like, "Well, this is how we do it." And a lot of times we'll give
Yeah.
advice, and probably the most simple piece of advice that I give is the best way for you to control a good pipeline is to be able to just react really quickly. There's a lot of developers out there that they have such a strenuous investment committee process. I asked a developer recently to explain their investment committee process to me because they were new to the market. And he explained like 4 rounds of investment committee approval. And it was like, well, the first round is to get the LOI out, and the second round is to get like permission to spend $10,000, and the third round is and basically all it really meant at the end of the day was he's putting properties under contract to get permission to spend a little bit of money, and he won't really know for like months and months and months if his company even really wants to do the deal. And we see that a
Yeah.
lot, and that's why you're saying you see these developers come in, tie properties up, and not close. Some of it is there wasn't even really an intention, but when you have these strong leaders that these companies trust to make decisions, I think that when the
Yeah.
when the leader can make decisions, obviously Paul was coming in for Watermark, and he was making probably a lot of those decisions. When you're talking to the source, you just have a much higher likelihood of being successful.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the groups have been successful. There's almost a level of discretion that they give that development associate or that leader, development partner, whoever that person is, whether it's coming from the top or they just have trusted that person to make a lot of those decisions, and they back them, and they make commitments to deals that are real commitments to deals, um, that they're gonna follow through on. Because the other example you're talking about, where it's very institutional and there's all this red tape and all these different levels, you know, a lot of times you'll see that come through just in the offer because they want a ton of time. That's one issue we have a lot of times in Houston is these guys will come in from out of state, and they're used to markets where they have deals under contract for years. And so their timing is just super long, and it doesn't fit the market, especially if they come in to Houston in a time when it's a hot market and people are doing deals fast. I mean, they just don't even have a chance, to get a deal if they're trying to move that slow.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Because really, at the end of the day in Houston, you're needing your time for due diligence and then capital or just getting your plans done. And that's a whole lot
Yeah.
faster process than you'd experience in these other markets. Um, but I'm thinking about some examples where we've seen this done well and where some of these developers have done a really good job, like 2 really large developers that we worked with that One of them was new to multifamily, and that was DR Horton. So we had Eric Overton
Yeah.
on not too long ago. When he took over DR Horton's multifamily platform in Texas, DR Horton's the largest home builder in the country. They have more processes than anyone, and there's a ton of red tape just because they're so large that they have to have before they're spending money and how they're spending money.
Yeah. Public company.
Eric was such
Yeah.
a good leader there and did such a good job of both, you know, fulfilling what they required of him and at the same time not losing good opportunities. And so I remember we would be pursuing, properties both in Houston. We did a deal on Brittmore. There was like a 3-owner assemblage that Tripp and I worked on with Eric. Super complicated deal, really challenging ownership dynamics. You wouldn't think that, a developer like a DR Horton would be able to negotiate something like that just because it was really kind of an outlier as far as what you had to agree to. And Eric did such a good
Yeah.
job. That deal happened. They built it. It's a great deal. Similar, examples of things that we worked on up here. And so he did a really good job of managing that process internally. What I really appreciate about him was he was always truthful with me on what was going on. And sometimes we
Yeah.
kind of know if a developer's telling us the whole truth or if we're also being brokered a little bit by the developer. And you build that relationship where I think the developers that know us start to realize that we really are there to help them be successful. We're trying to do everything we can to
Yeah.
help them win. The reason that we're giving them advice and, telling them what we think is because we're trying to help them. Eric understands that. And so he would tell me, oh, okay, this is going to be harder. Like, our investment committee meeting got pushed back. I've got to get beyond that meeting. But at least I had what I needed to be able to go talk to the landowner, keep the deal alive. And we were able to do that really successfully. So I think that was a good example. And the other large developer was Hines. Hines is global developer. They decided, they wanted to get more into multifamily probably 15 years ago now. They just saw that,
Yeah.
they had done so many large office and mixed use developments over the years. They needed to diversify more. And so, they hired a whole new team, really good talent. But again, large company, and with large companies, you have to have just a lot of, kind of processes in place. And so I remember when they called us and said, we want to get into, suburban. They had done the Waterwall project in Houston. They had done some really kind of neat urban projects. I think they did another one over in like the Rice Village area, but they hadn't really done anything
Yeah, they did.
suburban. And they saw the value of, like you were saying, suburban, getting some quick wins, building, selling, taking advantage of this growth. And so what we were able to do with them was actually help them come up with a process where they could respond really quickly to opportunities and get offers out very quickly. And we went and quickly put together a whole portfolio, really well located suburban sites around Houston. And they executed on all those sites and did really well. So again, it was just working alongside of them. Sometimes, it's easier for us to go work with just a one man band, but a group like Hines has the ability, if they can get their processes in order, to really scale, which we love working on those deals.
And that was a good point too. The speed of how fast you can react to the market, because we're talking about the buyer rep side of our business. We spend a lot of time working on listings and helping sellers sell, which a lot of times ends up being to developers or some sort of end user. But when we're on the buyer rep side, we're helping developers find these sites. A lot of times, if it's a good site in a good area, there's multiple offers. There's other strong groups who are trying to get it as well. And so being very quick with your offer and then having an offer that really is aggressive on a lot of the term, pricing, terms, earnest money, understanding, what fits in that point in time in the market and for that submarket and who we're likely to be up against and where their kind of pressure points are. Because we know these developers so well that sometimes we'll know like, hey, this group's going to be aggressive on price, but their timing won't be good, or their timing is going to be really good, their price won't be as good. And we know kind of where their earnest money is going to be, how fast they go hard with their earnest money, if they'll layer money in afterwards. And so, being able to be very quick and give the seller something real they can be close to what they want to get the deal. And, the best developers we've seen are the ones who can do that. They don't waste a lot of time. They make good offers. They respond very quickly. They know exactly what they want and what works. They know what doesn't work. And so that's really kind of a separation point, and I think Hines was a good example of that. That period of time when they did all those deals, they were very honed in on, "Here's our strategy, here's the submarkets, and we're gonna go execute this."
Yeah, and I think that conviction to execute is really important because both of us love sitting down with the developer, hearing their plan, and saying, what is your business plan? I mean, when we hear we want to go do, four deals in Houston, we'll do, three starts this year. We're okay. We're ready to go. Like, where do you want to be? We'll tell you. We'll give you our opinion. We can go execute on that. What's hard a lot of times is the developers maybe don't really know yet what they want, and so we'll see a developer go put a property under contract, and then another property becomes available. So then they drop the first property. They go to the second property. This just happened recently with a group in
Yeah,
Dallas that's a new group to the market. They put a property under contract. Then they dropped it for a site they thought was better in the same submarket. And now they just dropped that site and now they're pursuing a
yeah.
different submarket. And it is trial and error a little bit, but at the same time, I think we look at that and we think, gosh, the resources, the cost, the opportunity cost, it doesn't really have to be that way.
And reputation.
Yeah.
I mean, because your reputation starts to get around. I mean, there are certain groups that have reputation of, man, if they offer, and we'll tell this to our sellers all the time, man, if that group offered, we need to take this seriously. That's a good offer. They're a good group. They tend to follow through and do what they say they're going to do. And then there's some groups where it's like, man, we've seen them so many times drop deals, retrade deals, just really struggle that it almost doesn't matter what they offer because they're just not very credible. So I think reputation is really important. And it's almost a bigger deal when you're new to the market and coming in from out of state. If you come in and kind of screw some people around or drop some deals, you're going to develop a bad reputation quickly. It's going to make it hard to be successful in that market.
Yeah. And so maybe flipping the side here and going to more of the being on the seller side. We started by saying we are seeing developers pull out of the markets, developers that had come in because the times were good. So think post COVID, there was a big
Yeah.
rush on all of these kind of, they call them the smile states, but across the Southeast and Texas and over into Phoenix and Denver and kind of that whole area. Well, you had a lot of developers that either never got anything done. And so now they're, pulling back, or they bought some sites and owned some land sites, but they've decided they're not going to build those sites and they're pulling out of the market. And so in those cases, we're advising those developers on, looking at their portfolio. What do they have? Is this the right time to sell? A lot of that's going to depend on what type of money they used to capitalize these deals, how patient they are. Because, in the type of deals are they urban? Are they suburban? What's the market to sell them? And so we're having a lot of those conversations too.
No, that's right. Yeah, and it's interesting because if you think about that period of time, we could say post COVID, but really it was just post the beginning of COVID. That really probably actually the years of COVID. If you think 2020, through 2022 was probably really the time we were like really struggling with COVID I guess globally. We also saw a ton of development, a lot of activity across all the Texas markets, and then you got to 2023 when COVID was really kind of dissipating and people were moving on. Then you had rate hikes, but the whole business plan that we saw at that time with lower interest rates is completely changed now. So a lot of these developers, they're holding sites that they're thinking we can't even make sense of this to go build it. And so the only real option is just to sell it because we don't see, the market changing and rates coming down enough, to actually go fulfill the business plan we initially had for this site.
What's interesting is, I'm interested if this is more of a Dallas phenomena than Houston, but because these developers bought these properties, a lot of them semi-tested the market, like, 2023, 2024. Maybe they were just getting offers, maybe they weren't officially on the market, but actually pricing in a lot of cases was probably stronger then for someone else to come in and take them out. I'm thinking of some deals that we listed and then just some offers we made where I don't know if it's because there was still a little bit of like an overhang on the market and just a belief because there was a survive to 2025. And so developers were still trying to build pipeline, make offers. Maybe some of the headwinds of the supply that was coming just hadn't come yet and delivered in some of these markets. Because we made offers kind of all over DFW to developers that own sites. fast forward to today, and I would say in a lot of cases, those same properties, for sure those buyers are no longer there. But some of those same properties are just, they're not going to be able to sell at that same price today that they were at, even kind of post the big land rush and when there were just other developers that were still trying to figure out some deals. And so I think that's really just to say you got to be careful that you don't believe that holding on another year, that for sure it'll be better next year. It's, we just need to hold on
Yeah.
one more year. Because looking ahead and thinking about, well, what's going to happen over the next year, if rates were to come down next year, a lot of those developers that are sitting on sites, it'll still be challenging for them to get their specific projects out of the ground. Because on a lot of those projects, there's kind
Yeah.
of a reason that they got stuck. And there's a lot of other competing projects. And if those competing projects start getting built, it's just going to make it that much more difficult for them to develop. And so I think that's just
Yeah.
really important to remember that holding, for sure, your basis will go up as you hold, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the value of the land is going up.
Yeah, and I think the big problem areas that you're probably referring to are more of these infill deals and certain types of product like route product or high rise product or very kind of smaller sites or very high density surface park that are at a really premium pricing. I think that's where we've seen in Houston some developers hold sites. They're good historically good submarkets, but these are deals that had to just be at like, the pinnacle of pricing to make sense. And so they're holding those sites thinking like this is a really good site, it's a good submarket. Like if I hold, I can get out of this. And the market just hasn't rewarded that because we haven't seen the market be very aggressive for those kind of sites. And I would say in Houston, we didn't see as much. I think we got hit maybe a little bit harder than you guys did in Dallas when rates came up. I feel like people really pulled back on Houston quickly, which may have been a little bit of a blessing for us from a fundamental standpoint because just a lot didn't get done. And so our fundamentals are pretty good in Houston right now. Um, but I think we are starting to see all those groups try and sell now. I think really in the last 9 to 12 months, we've started to see a big movement of those groups either going to market or just calling us saying, "Hey, we would sell, and this is kind of our pricing. Can you bring us a buyer?" And so there's a number of those deals that we're under, either have closed or under contract on right now that are either infill or suburban. And for the most part, I think the groups are doing pretty well. There's a couple areas where the market just got so beat down that they actually did have higher pricing a year ago. Um, and the markets just those submarkets specifically have continued to deteriorate. And then the pricing just keeps dropping. And they're like, we're still selling, we're still getting out because we just know holding is not, we just need to kind of cut this thing loose. So,
Yeah, if you bought close to the height of the market from a land pricing standpoint back in 2021, early 2022, you're in a pretty difficult position just because pricing got
yeah,
so high. But fortunately, a lot of these developers didn't. They were still paying probably what was still, a pretty good price. Like we sold a site earlier this year owned by a developer and they ended up making money on it, making a good amount of money on it because yes, they bought in 2021 when the market was crazy, but they actually had a really good basis on the dirt. And so there are developers like that where if you have a good basis on the dirt, it's actually going to be a lot harder to go and build the project than it might be to go sell it at more of like a market price today to somebody else that's a bigger sponsor or really just needs to get a project going, needs to get something built and be able to make a really good amount of money a lot quicker than if you try to go develop it yourself.
yeah. Why would you say a group might, out of state group might pull out of Dallas? And maybe part of the answer is they just did some deals and weren't very good deals, and so they have a bad taste in their mouth. But I mean, if you think about, how strong Dallas is, how well it's positioned, I think Texas in general, but I think Dallas specifically, if you're a multifamily developer and you're in Dallas and you can't make sense of it and you're pulling out, I mean, what do you think some reasons for that might be?
I think it's probably always has to do a little bit more with the macro on that specific company. What else is going on in their company, in their portfolio? It may not just be a Dallas problem, but it could, if you're advancing into new regions, new opportunities and expanding, the first thing when there's challenges you're going to pull back is those regions, that are just less less stable. There's less going on. Maybe you have less, overhead there and go focus again on kind of the core principles of the company. So, you know, several different developers come to mind that have pulled out. One of them, I think it was more product type. Their whole company was built around the highest end multifamily. So it was a lot of, high rise, was a lot of just really dense urban, but not even just dense urban, like the nicest project. So every project they would do, they wanted to be, 20, 30 cents higher than the highest comp in the market.
Yeah.
We haven't been in that kind of a market. That's not really where equity is wanted to be. It's really hard to compete in a market like Dallas when there's so many developers that are willing to go build a nice project, but for just a lower cost project. And so they can pay the same price for
Yeah.
the land because they don't have to put so much extra money into it to get higher rents. And so I think for them, it was probably more of like a product issue because they tried to translate that to the suburbs and they tried to redefine who they were into a lower cost product and they just really weren't able to. And again, it's because of competition. Them trying to go compete in the
Yeah.
suburbs against some of these other developers that are eating and breathing the suburbs all the time just didn't work. And so they ended up pulling out of Dallas. Still very active in the southeast. And then another developer, just I think they got ahead of themselves on purchases, bought several sites, and then the market changed. The way they were planning to capitalize those deals didn't pan out. Some of the deals they had a good basis, some of them they didn't. And I think they looked at the market and I think they actually had a lot of foresight and that they pulled the plug early on, like back kind of right after rates went up. It didn't take them long to realize like this isn't coming back soon. And so I
Yeah.
think their thought was we'll hold on to our land sites for now. And when it comes back, we'll develop them. And if we don't, we'll sell them. But we're not going to keep, an entire team out there just to kind of sit around because we don't see a whole lot happening. So that was really their thought. So I could see them potentially coming back or maybe just joint venturing the land that they still own if they don't, develop it themselves. And then, the other developer was interesting one that was really active in Houston too. And I think they brought in a product from overseas that they thought was going to be really
Yeah.
active. And they were active buying properties and it just didn't translate. The product didn't translate. The cost to build it didn't translate. They got a couple projects done and then I think very quickly realized this isn't working. And so decided that they would transition into just divesting of all of those assets and pulling out. So I think some of these are bigger company problems. I agree with you. There's
Yeah.
not really a reason to be pulling out of Texas for any developer that wants to remain relevant because I think whenever you make the decision to pull out, you're losing a lot of institutional knowledge and you're losing a lot of just time that it'll take to get back. And to your point, you're losing a little bit of reputation in the market too because there's the developers that stick it out that everybody knows that in the hot times they'll do several deals and when it's tough, maybe they're only doing one or two, but like they're always in the market.
Yeah. And I think the point of the strategy is, you have to be able to execute that strategy, better or at least as well as the other groups in the market. And so if your MO is not doing workforce housing and you're going to try and, readjust your strategy to workforce housing, there are some groups who are really good at workforce housing, in Dallas and Houston and, the Texas markets. And so for some of these out of town guys, trying to pivot to doing something else doesn't really work when you're just not competitive at that. And so then they just pull out. How do you advise your sellers when you have, a lot of these listings will get, 10 offers or 15 offers. And, historically we've had, offers coming in from some of these groups that are internationally based or, they're from, the coastal markets or the Midwest or out of town guys. And then you may also have a national brand like a TCR or an Alliance or a Hines or someone like that, but they're more of like a local player, maybe JPI. How do you sort of think through that and maybe what would you help your seller look at when trying to analyze, these out of town groups and how you would kind of separate, hey, we're not going to really even consider these guys because of these issues, but we're interested in the offer from these guys because they're out of town guys and they sort of check some certain boxes.
It's going to depend on if it's an out of town group that we are familiar with or if it's one that is just so new that we're not familiar with them. And so, it normally what happens is these out of town groups will come to us and they'll start talking to us about our listings, and then we'll start working on different deals, and we'll get a pretty good feeling very quickly for how they operate and just where their capital is coming from. There's just a lot of screening questions that we always have to really get to the bottom of how real these groups are. And so then when you get to that situation where there's offers being made, I think for both of us, when we're talking to these buyers in the lead up to the offer being made, we're looking for like, what questions are they asking? Are they asking like intelligent questions? Are they asking the type of questions they need to be asking? Or is it, what are you guys asking for this property? 10 million. Okay. And then we both have an inbox, an offer in our inbox for 10.2 million. It's okay. That
Yeah,
isn't a
yeah,
very real offer. And that happens. Like that happens a lot where
yeah,
you'll be like, did I even talk to that group and I got an offer from them? And it's like, oh yeah, I did. I just told them like kind of guidance price and that they just made an offer, And so that's a
yeah,
big part of it. And then, I think when you're analyzing those different groups, we have such an advantage because, whether it's JPI or Trammell Crow or Wood Partners or Alliance or whoever it is, we have so much history with them, understanding the way they operate. I mean, we're talking about decades of experience with the way they operate. And we're not just talking about like that deal person. We know how the company operates. Like we know their DNA. And so when an owner is looking at 15 offers, normally 15 offers, you're really looking at probably 3 to 5, that are
yeah,
that are really in contention. And so, it would be hard to pass up on, like a really quality sponsor that's embedded, ingrained in that market over
yeah,
one of these other groups. I think the reality is this new group would have to do something outside of what those other groups are doing. It's kind of like the new guy tax. I just think there would have to be because
yeah,
we talk about transaction risk a lot. Transaction risk is real and so important because you get a false start, you lose 6 months, you could miss an entire market. You could still own the property for years after that. And so you want to pick the right buyer. So maybe it's hard money day one. Are they willing to do that? And if Trammell Crow is, well, are they willing to do more? Because that's maybe the tax they're gonna have to pay, or is it a higher price? Like
yeah.
we're guiding to 10 million. We have offers around that, but if they really want this deal, they're gonna have to step up. But then we still have to feel good after all of that analysis that it isn't just an offer on a page because it's really easy to put an offer on a page. And so that's where the hard money probably speaks louder than anything else.
And I think a lot of those groups, we'll find out pretty quickly how real we think they are because a lot of them actually will come through our office.
Yeah.
They're going to call us and say, hey, we're new to the market. We want to see sites. Can we meet with you guys? And so we'll meet with them and then we'll start showing them some sites and we'll see them make offers. And then we find out really quick, like, hey, we're impressed. These guys are strong. They're strong. They're making good offers. We can just sense that the development partner is, and kind of we talked about like a leader, entrepreneurial, creative, there's some things like that. Or it's like, man, they made a couple offers or super long time frames. They won't change that. They're having a hard time, underwriting deals. And so I think it's probably, I don't know if you'd agree, Tom, it's pretty rare that we've had a group who's a new group that we didn't get to know pretty quickly. Not just for that specific listing offer they made, but for other activity they're doing in the market. Whether we're involved or not, we'll start hearing like, oh, they dropped this deal, or, we'll start hearing stuff about them that either gives us a good feeling or a bad feeling. But I think back to your other point, so often we'll work with sellers and everybody's looking for the unicorn, like who's the group that's going to pay me, 10% more or 50% more than the rest of the market. And they assume it's, a lot of times it's these buzzwords of it, this international group that no one's ever heard of that's going to come overpay, or maybe it's some coastal group. And we've actually seen that happen a couple times, or we've actually brought some of those groups in. They have paid, market leading numbers, but it's extremely rare. And a lot of times there's a ton of deal risk with those groups. And normally the higher paying buyer who has less transaction risk is the group that's more of the local group who understands, working with the city, understands the specific submarkets, the fundamentals, has all their sort of folks on the ground that they have a lot of experience working with to help them get the deal done. And so they just have an advantage, that someone, new coming in the market. I liked how you said that there's sort of like a new guy tax. I think that that's very true. The guys who come in and actually do deals a lot of times have to do something a little bit extra to go get those deals. And then they have to close and prove themselves.
So maybe kind of in wrapping up, I was going to ask you if you're talking to a developer right now that's owned a property, and for a lot of these developers, they've owned it since 21 or 22, because that was just the time when everyone was buying sites. Maybe it was 22, but you're talking to a developer that's 3 years into owning a property. What type of advice are you giving them when they ask the question, Tim, like, should I list my property now or do I wait a year? But especially, let's just say they don't really want to wait like 2 years, because, they don't want to be
Yeah.
5 years into holding a property and then going under contract. So they're kind of trying to ask us how do I get the property sold like in the next 18 months? When should I go?
Yeah, and it probably depends on. I mean, there's a couple questions. First of all, are they? I guess you're saying that this is a situation where the developers decide they're not going to build
Yeah.
it, right? They're going to sell. So I think if you're saying, okay, I'm going to sell, it probably depends on the deal. But a lot, like we said earlier, a lot of these developer-owned sites are pretty attractive to the market, because the rest of the development community is saying, hey, they bought it, they have plans for it. And so we're seeing those deals, like now is a good time to sell those deals, even though there's issues in the market. I mean, I would say it's not a great market right now. There's a lot of headwinds, but a lot of these sites are still trading. And we actually had a deal recently that we're in the market with, that a developer had dropped. And so another developer came in with capital. And this is a very strong developer that we've done a lot with over the years. We have a lot of confidence in them, a good relationship where they're not going to say, hey, we like this deal, we have capital, and that not be true. And, our owner was like, man, and this is a developer, and he's like, maybe I should just kind of wait till things get better. And I'm like, if you wait 9 months until things get better, they may not
Yeah.
get better. And then you're talking about another 9 months, and you're talking about 18
Yeah.
months now before you maybe have a closing. And you have a group that has capital, they're credible, they have a lot of experience closing deals, and they low transaction risk. You would think you'd at least give them a shot. And if they don't get done, they don't get it done. But I would say they have a 70-80% chance of getting it done. So it probably does depend on the site. But I think, some of these areas, like these infill sites, I just think you really got to think hard about just continuing to hold, because I don't think we're in the kind of cycle where it's just going to get better and we're going to be back to the races and see, $200 pricing, $300 pricing like we've seen in the past. I think we could be settling into kind of more of a, just kind of a tepid market in the infill market, where there's some trades and, there's some deals that happen that are better pricing, but not incredible pricing. Developers are just very conservative on the infill stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting conversation. We'll be working with, developers, I'm sure, as long as we do this, that are coming in from other places. We, like you said, we've seen that from overseas, other states, other cities. And then there's always going to be, unfortunately, groups where it just doesn't work out, for one reason or another, and they're exiting. But I think we see opportunity on both sides to help these new developers as they're coming in, to just learn our markets, to understand how they can be successful. And then, help these developers as they're exiting and hopefully coming back, but exiting at different time periods to be successful on these properties. And then hopefully that encourages them to come back in the future.
Yeah, it's fun. I think there's a need. It's a neat feeling to be able to help someone that's in a tougher spot, where they feel like they made a mistake. They have a deal that hasn't worked out the way they wanted it to, but then we're able to come in and work with them and still get them out of it. Maybe either making a little bit of money or just get them out of it at a good number that we all feel good about. There's a good sense of accomplishment with that, I think, for us.
Thank you for listening to our podcast today. If you have questions about land you own in Texas, send us an email at texaslandguys@dmre.com and follow us on LinkedIn to stay updated.